Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to New Books in Critical Theory, a podcast channel of New Books Network. I'm Gadam Sulongkumar, the host of this channel, and today I'm here with Dr. Jason Storm to talk about his book, Metamodernism, The Future of Theory. The interesting thing about the book, for me personally, right, was this one, that the book really resonated personally with me in a sense that when I was reading through the book, I was kind of agreeing with the theory that is being presented. So I think that is something which is very interesting about the book that really resonated with me in myself as a reader. That was something which caught me. Secondly, the thing about this book is every chapter is a really big and a work and a big topic in itself. And I think this work or this book has a long way to go in the sense of arguing about it, in the sense of developing the theories and the ideas that has been presented in the book. So I think it's a very dense book. And I should say this book, as I've said, will be talked and debated about in the years to come in the area of social sciences and in the field of theoretical development in the social sciences. So I think that is something which is very unique and interesting about this book. So let me just go straight to you, Dr. Jason. Tell me something about yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, so just to give you a little bit of background, let's see, I'm not sure what level to narrativize at, but I'll just say, so this is my third book, and it kind of emerges out of things I've been grappling with now, really since graduate school. So already when I was in graduate school, I was just absolutely enamored with theory, with critical theory, basically, with continental philosophy, or sometimes postmodernism, depending on, they're slightly overlapping sets, but not exactly the same thing. And even longer, I had been enamored with kind of world philosophy. I had done background, and my dissertation was ultimately on Japanese thinkers, but I had, been into Chinese philosophy and South Asian philosophy and a little bit of African philosophy and indigenous political theory and what have you. And but the thing that this book emerged from was an interest that started, especially in graduate school, with continental philosophical thought. And so I was one of those fanboys who would go around to lectures by famous philosophers. Like I went to Derrida's lectures or Cornel West's lectures or Richard Rorty's lectures, and just tried to kind of soak it all in, and I had the fortuitous happenstance of being located in places where I did my graduate schooling at Harvard and Stanford, and then in Paris for 2 years, where there was a lot of happening in terms of philosophy and in terms of theory. And I loved it. And I kind of grew to just sort of really deeply into a kind of postmodernist or post-structuralist theoretical formation. But after a certain point, I started to see its limitations. And I started to see that this theory that had constantly positioned itself, for example, as anti-hegemonic, had become hegemonic, and that while it had made much valuable forms of progress, intellectual progress in certain regards, also was encountering predictable dead ends. And a lot of theory had become stuff that, its best theory was brilliant and insightful and either had political or intellectual resonances and all this stuff, but at its worst, it was American academics writing as if they were bad translations of the French, or saying stuff that just sounded really cool, but if you thought about it long and hard, it didn't actually mean anything. And so partially, this book kind of emerged out of me grappling with my own formation, the intellectual formation I had in graduate school, and trying to work through this sort of basis of what we might call, heterodox philosophy, or philosophy that's not taught in philosophy departments, and trying to figure out what was useful, what was worth consolidating, and what wasn't, and what was actually getting in the way. And so that's one way to put it. The other way I'd talk about the intellectual formation of this book, especially for your listeners who might be in areas like religious studies, is that I had already written a first book, The Invention of Religion in Japan, that was grappling with the category religion and how Japanese thinkers encountered it for the first time and the problems they had with it, and alongside categories such as secularism, science, superstition, etc. And in religious studies, we have come to a moment where we have, for a bunch of good reasons, come to dissolve or reject the category religion itself. to argue that it's no longer useful for a range of different reasons. And I was part of the movement that did that. And I'm not trying to walk back any of those critical insights, but rather, after a certain point, I started talking to friends of mine in other units, people in English departments who had similar issues with the category of literature, or people in aesthetics who had similar problems with art, or anthropologists who were similarly skeptical of the category culture, etc. And then my own secondary training is in an area of basically science and technology studies. And so the category science, although perhaps not in the exact same way, has also been critically challenged in science studies as well. So, but what I discovered was that people were making very analogous arguments in a whole bunch of different areas. And so, but not to say that these arguments were wrong, but that they had a kind of, well, what do we do next to them? And what do we do if we say, okay, religion's not good? Some scholars would say, so we should use this category of culture. But then anthropologists saying we shouldn't use the category of culture. We should use the category of literature. But then the English department literature was being defaulted into religion or whatever. It was a cycle going around and around. And so one of the things that originally inspired this book was recognizing that these arguments were happening in parallel, trying to figure out why they started happening and what we could do about them, how positively we could build off of those kind of fundamental critical insights. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And in your introduction, I think you have talked about yourself and also the influence of the book, of how you came to write about the book, and that's really interesting in a sense of how you have been dabbling into different disciplines and looking at its development and trying to see it from a broader lens and trying to really understand it in terms of your academic development and in terms of your studies, specifically the area of religion. So I think that's a really good introduction, and I think as a scholar, I think that is something which is very much needed and important in a sense of dabbling with different disciplines when you're looking at the concepts and certain ideas and all. So I think that itself, in itself, is stokes or says something interesting about the book itself. So let's just straight away go into the contents of the book. I think I'm more interested into going into the contents of the book. So let's just go straight into the contents. So
Sounds
we'll
good.
Go chapter by we'll go chapter by chapter, and each chapter is a vast topic in itself. So I think we'll see how much we can cover in this short time on this chapter, but I think we'll discuss some important, as Dr. Jason brings about, we'll discuss some important points in the chapter. So I think in the opening is more about the introduction and overview of the book. So let's just go into the part one of the book, that is meta-realism. Now, the first chapter, the part one consists of one chapter, and the chapter is titled as How the Real World Becomes a Fable, or the Realities of Social Construction. Now, as I've seen, this chapter is all about realism and anti-realism and all. So can you discuss something about this book, this chapter? Yeah.
Yeah. So just to give your readers just one little piece from the introduction before I go into that chapter. So the book is working through postmodernism as an academic model. So not a periodization, but as an academic model, and trying to work through it in terms of 5 different areas. One of which is this meta-realism, is a question of realism and anti-realism. And so, and my methodology, listeners should know, is broadly Hegelian, although I'm not like a Hegel fanboy, but I think Hegel has an important insight, which is that faced with a certain kind of skepticism, what Hegel calls the dialectic, there's a tendency for the movement of thought in various academic disciplines to begin with a positive statement, a critique of that. So a positive position or a general abstraction, a negation. And then Hegel thinks that there's this key moment that thought turns on, which is the negation of the negation, which is how you find your way past certain kinds of paradoxical or skeptical impasses. And so what I decided to do in this book was to take that broad strategy, not like a meat grinder or something, like you can't just throw things into the dialectic and have them automatically spit out conclusions, but to kind of think through a set of problems or oppositions with that kind of suspicion in mind, to try and think about what would the negation of the negation look like of a particular formation, and in each case to produce something that should stand on its own, so even without its prior antecedents. So and you're exactly right, Tia, that the book's complicated, and each chapter is really like something that I could have written a whole book on, and I try and suck them down into something quite manageable, but it means that I had to cut a lot. So there's a lot more there than there's a lot in the footnotes, basically. Like if you read the footnotes, they're crazy, and it's because I have adopted also a sort of counter-hegemonic reading program or anti-disciplinary reading program where I read like really widely in any area. So not just, and I want to read people I disagree with as well as people, or I think that I'm going to disagree with as well as people I already think I'm going to agree with, et cetera. So to go into specifically, the first problem that the book sets out from is one of the stereotypes of something called postmodernism as an academic category, as an academic model. And in the introduction, I also historicize the category postmodernism, but so readers can read that. And so the first thing that postmodernism is often accused of is being a species of anti-realism. And so there's this common shorthand, which is like postmodern anti-realist, that scholars kind of flip out for somebody probably that they don't really like. It's not something that they're engaging seriously. It's often meant in a polemical kind of way. And then you start to wonder, well, who are the postmodern anti-realists? If you're skeptical, if you're have the kind of intellectual frame of mind that I do. And, you would look at scholars like Derrida, for example, who say, well, actually, I'm not trying to argue against the real. I'm interested in the real precisely where it disrupts discourse. So is that anti-realism? Well, it's a little bit hard for me to tell. Or, or you might look at, a whole range of people. Most of the figures that get called postmodernists were not themselves anti-realists. They were something closer to kind of Kantians or skeptical neo-Kantians. So the question is, who are the anti-realists and who are the realists, and what do they really agree or disagree with each other about? And so that's where the chapter kind of begins from, and it begins with a reference to Nietzsche, who is often considered one of the most famous anti-realists because of a particular formulation of his. Just to give you the quote, the real world, an idea that is of no further use, not even as a compulsion, a useless idea, an idea that has become redundant, hence a disproved idea. Let's do away with it. And this is from Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. But the position that Nietzsche comes to, for instance, is actually the denial of a real world behind the world of appearances. So Nietzsche is actually adopting a position. He's anti-Kantian. He's going to say there's no thing in itself. There's no real outside what we experience. But that position that gets called anti-realism in Nietzsche is the same position that sometimes gets called realism in other sectors of the academy. It's a kind of positivism that rejects the phenomena. So that's our first clue, that what we think of when we're opposing realisms and anti-realisms is often either less or more than it appears. And let me be even more specific. Sometimes realisms turn into each other, turn into anti-realisms and vice versa. And I trace some of those in the chapter. But more specifically also, I think a lot of the fight about realism is about the status of the current scientific worldview. And so people are calling each other realists or anti-realists for their opinions about whether the status of the quote unquote scientific paradigm. But often the people having the fight are not themselves scientists. They don't necessarily know what the current scientific paradigm is. So you see people fighting for things that any theoretical physicist would laugh at or whatever. It seems that a lot of it is a lot of the debates around realism and anti-realism, people are just talking past each other. Both groups are saying, yes, the world isn't as it appears commonsensically, and both of them are saying certain paradigmatic statements in the natural sciences are approximately true, or maybe we might be a little bit more or less confident in them. That seems to be what the debate is around. But the place where the realism, anti-realism debate occurs most in philosophy of social sciences, and this is where it attracted the majority of my interest, people are fighting about being realist or anti-realist without being very clear about what they're talking about. In some cases, they tend to adopt the notion of realism that is connected to notions of mind independence. So they say that the real is what is mind independent. And this is where it gets tangled in conversations about social construction. And one of the things that I'm very interested in that chapter is how we talk about social construction. But there's this irony of scholars in the humanities and social sciences talking about mind independence, because you would think that most things that we're interested in are social formations in one form or another, and are in that respect precisely mind dependent. And while there's been a lot of ink spilled around mind independence, I observe that mind dependence has been rarely theorized. People haven't spent a lot of time thinking about, well, what do we really mean when we're talking about mind dependent? How many different ways could something be dependent on mind? And so I begin by providing a kind of typology. You might think of certain things as, like, for example, causally mind dependent, like my car was minds came together to build my car. A bunch of people thought about it. They planned the car. They had an idea for how to build it, my Subaru. They put it together. So it might have been, so it's causally mind dependent. If there were no people in the world, there would never be a car, if there'd never been any people. But on the other hand, and in that respect, the car might seem to be paradigmatically socially constructed. But on the other hand, if it hits you, it's still going to kill you. So that kind of mind dependence isn't a question about non-reality, but rather a question about how it came together, historical contingency, et cetera. And anyway, I come up with a typology of about 5 or so different kinds of mind dependence. And I think those will be useful for helping us specify what we're doing in a lot more detail when we're talking about things like social construction. But the other payoff of this chapter, and moving a little bit quickly, because I know we want to get through a somewhat long book, is that I came to recognize that the category of real is itself primarily a contrastive term. Like if you really push in on it, there are many different ways for things to be described as real. So the example I use in the chapter is that a statue of Madonna might be a real statue, but not the real Madonna. But there are many different ways. Like a dream might be real in the sense that we experience it, or not real in the sense that it didn't actually happen in the physical world, or whatever. Or you can come up with tons of different ways. Something could be not real because it's not the real Madonna. Could also mean like it's not the famous pop celebrity Madonna, or it's not the Madonna, the mother of Christ, or all these are different kinds of ways that someone could actually be a person, but not the real Madonna. All that is to say, I think that the notion of the real often obscures what it is we're actually fighting about. And what we need is that there's an implicit contrast category that is rarely specified. And so what we need to do is be meta about realism. In other words, be able to be self-conscious and self-reflexive about when people are using the category real and referring to something as real or not real, rather than taking for granted the existence of the real as a category, as a fundamental category. And so in that chapter, I work through a bunch of different thinkers, and I try and specify, articulate that, and describe its relevance for those of us who are working on a whole range of things. I think it clears up a lot of debates around, for example, people want to say that the satanic panic of the late 1980s wasn't real, insofar as people want to argue, was it real or was it not real? Well, we now can say, be more sophisticated about that. We can say it was not real insofar as we know there weren't any satanic cults abusing people, at least not on large scale, but it was real insofar as people were panicking about it, or what have you. It lets us be more fine-grained about what we're talking about when we're talking about categories like the real. The other thing that I would say that it also, this is not a species. A lot of people think that, what we need to say is that if you're really experiencing something, it is real. But that isn't really saying anything. You're not adding something. If everything somebody say that they're experiencing is something that's real to them, that's tautological. You're just restating that they're experiencing something. And often people are self-deceived and are misguided about the things that they're experiencing. I thought I saw a snake, and then, and then I was freaked out about it. And then I looked later and I realized it wasn't a snake. So, we have to just be more sophisticated. So we can say he really believed he saw a snake, and that might be irrelevant whether there really was a snake there or not, but it lets us be more sophisticated about how we're using the term real. Yeah. And so that's the kind of meta-realism I led in that chapter. And it shows us how in that chapter, I'm trying to work us past the assumption of the binary opposition between realists and anti-realists, show what they share, kind of cancel them out in a certain way, and then figure out how we might productively move forward in the humanities and social sciences. And in that way, it serves as a sort of blueprint or prime example of the kind of work I'm doing throughout the book. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. So I think this is where I think social sciences comes in. Because for me as an anthropologist, my basic training is anthropology, but I'm very interested in philosophy at the same time. And in philosophy, the dichotomy between realism and anti-realism is very starkly dichotomized, right? And this is where philosophers work from. But then as social scientists, looking at this realism and anti-realism and trying to understand this one, it brings up a different flavor in trying to understand this dichotomy. And then, as you have clearly mentioned, that the dichotomy sometimes maybe falls in the sense of how we understand certain categories in the social life, right? And I think that is something which is very important in the sense of the contribution in this very chapter, and as the way you have conceptualized the complexity and the concept of realism and anti-realism, and then propounded a very an understanding of materialism. So I think that is what I would say the very important aspect of this chapter, talking about realism and interrealism. Now let's go to part 2 of the book, Process Social Ontology. And this is the second chapter here. The second chapter is titled as Concepts in Disintegration and Strategies for Demolition. Now, here you talk about the fluid nature of concepts. So can you expound more on this very chapter here?
Yeah, so in the chapter 2, which at one time was going to be like the whole book, basically, but then thankfully I expanded beyond it, or had a bunch of different issues. It is an attempt to deal with these categories. So, it begins with quotes about the end of various disciplines. In parts of the social sciences, the category of the social was disintegrated. In parts of anthropology, the category of culture was disintegrated. In religion, we've disintegrated the category of religion, in religious studies, for instance. And so what this chapter does is it tries to figure out what different ways people came to criticize those categories. Why did we come to criticize those categories at the same moment? And then it notes that there are certain common strategies through which categories are typically disintegrated. These master categories are typically disintegrated. What it does, and so far this is one of the chapters about which I've had some of the most positive feedback by emails already, particularly from graduate students who say, oh, great, you're telling us what we really need to know about how this works. Because what I do is I provide a kind of quote unquote deconstructive dojo, by which I mean a set of strategies by which you can destroy or take apart any conceptual category, basically, and that scholars have used to make those, to engage in that kind of demolition. So, it tells you about, so I do it by surveying, the critique of the category of religion, and the category art and art history, and philosophy of art, et cetera, and showing that, and then building off of those in a lot of other areas, and showing that basically there's a kind of skepticism around categories that can take different forms. It can be normative, or it can be epistemological, or it can be kind of anthropological, but it all tends to make similar kinds of observations around categories that look like unities, but are actually heterogeneous, or categories that most of our categories have built-in normative force that we don't tend to recognize, or there's a lot of intellectual energy and anxiety over the way that categories change or are heterogeneous. So, the term religion hasn't always meant the same thing at all times in all places. Scholars after scholar will say culture X does not have our category of art or whatever, without necessarily specifying what the who is the we in that sentence. But anyway, it doesn't have their category. Or by showing the heterogeneity of things. All the things subsumed under the notion of economics are actually incredibly diverse and don't really look the same. Anyway, I lay out a set of those strategies, and I lay them out a little bit playfully. I call it a kind of deconstructive JoJo, and I provide or describe them as if they're kind of recipes for demolition. But I think my business is pretty serious in that my goal is not to make fun of those critiques, but actually to figure out, well, if all these social categories can be criticized in similar ways, what does it tell us about how those categories themselves were formulated and put together, or how they work? So in other words, kind of granting the deconstructive enterprise for what insights it might provide us on how humans and other kinds of social animals construct and build their conceptual architecture and even social worlds. So, and I also historicize it to some extent. I talk a little bit about Wittgenstein and the turn against certain notions of the concept and what have you. But in any case, and I look at different attempts that people have formulated in many different disciplines, but that tend to converge on the same kinds of strategies to try and reject or resist the dissolution of the categories. And I show how, you might think that the answer is to go to polythetic classes or prototype-based category formation, but how that leads to contradictions. Or you might think that if you grant one piece of it, if you just grant open categories, or if you just grant reporting, whatever your anthropological interlocutors report, that's good enough. And I show how all of those kinds of things terminate in different kinds of impasses. And what one discipline tried is trying today, other disciplines tried and failed 20 years ago or something. Like, I don't know, even I was at this conference, a virtual conference in Germany last week, where scholars were, unbeknownst to themselves, recovering, we're defending the category of religion by recovering what was called basically the institutional theory of art, which philosophers of art had built in, had argued, Dickey and others around art, 20 or 30 years ago, maybe even more, and which had then collapsed. And so, I was able to say, hey, look, this argument that you're making, you probably don't know this because you think religion is a unique category, but if you look at these other debates, you'll see we can accelerate the conversation. We can see where this critique is going to dead end and where it's actually going to get you into more trouble than get us into more trouble than it gets us out of. So that chapter is probably the most negative chapter in the book. It is the one that is the most demolition oriented. But I think that demolition is important because part of the function of the whole project is that I'm not trying to deny or repudiate critical acumen or critique or deconstruction so much as work through it and out the other side. I think we do need an orientation toward our conceptual categories that having first deconstructed them, the thing is it just can't end there. So having deconstructed religion, you might think, there is nothing more to be said and go home or something like that. But actually, I think we can actually grant the critiques and work forward. And that's what I then try and do in the other chapters in that section.
Yeah. Some of the things that you have said about concepts and how they are built philosophically, right? How they are built and, how people understand it and how we use it and how it changes through history. I think that is something which was quite interesting about this chapter in that sense. And I think readers will also find this aspect of the chapter really interesting in the sense of trying to really understand the heart of what really concept is, and how it really morphs in terms of history and in terms of the usage of how people uses it. And I think this chapter is also really very much integrated by the other chapters that are there in the second section. And the third chapter is process social ontology. And what really is process social ontology? Now, people talk about process theism and what not process, and also what really is this process social ontology? Yeah.
Yeah, great. And so one of the things I'm also committed to in this book is not being an example of, I'll say, not bullshit theory. What I mean to say is that a lot of theory is stuff that sounds really cool, but you don't really know what it is. And if you push into it too far, it turns out to be just some kind of jargon. Or, scholars will say something that sounds fabulous, but then if you really think about the implications, doesn't make any sense. In opposition to that, I wanted to be very clear about my theoretical terms. I'm not saying you shouldn't invent new terms. That's part of one of the value of theory. But I also try and gloss all of them. I try and explain all of them so that, I want you to be able to tell if I'm wrong, and know what, you may disagree with me. You should know what you're disagreeing with. I don't want to hide behind any kind of obscurantism. And so what I'm talking about in process social ontology is I'm merging two things together. In the first instance, this is this question, the word ontology has become this weird buzzword in a lot of different disciplines that actually don't necessarily realize that they're talking past each other. For many anthropologists, the word ontology functions roughly as a proxy for an older ontological category of worldview. But it's like, each people has its own ontology or something like that. Or, maybe it's a little more robust than that because it's talking about ways of world making, not just worldviews. But still, it tends to be kind of relativizing to engage in ontology in that sense. Whereas in political theory, ontology, and I'm thinking of the work in folks like Jane Bennett and some of her followers, ontology functions as a description of things that exist. The question is like, what exists and what has agency in their particular vocabulary. And so I'm more interested in this tertiary sense, in this later sense, in this sense of ontology being a question about what exists or how does it exist. In other words, by doing social ontology, I'm interested in how is it that social things come into being? What is it that we're talking about when we're talking about social? What is it that, money, you might make money out of 5 different kinds of objects. You might have a coin or paper or digital cards or plastic chips or whatever. You might even, all of which is equally money. So what about it makes it money? And what about it, what is it about the social that makes things social? And so that question about how social things exist is what this chapter begins to explore. And I answer it by looking at processes. So what I want to suggest is that there has been a robust critique in a bunch of different areas about what you could call reification, which is called thingification, or in terms of the followers of Whitehead, in terms of misplaced concreteness, Marxist theory, again, Fremdom, alienation, or thingification. And so all of this suggests that we have a tendency I think these critics are right, that we have a tendency as social beings of treating objects in our social sphere, our categories, as if they were basically like natural kinds, as if, and there's also psychological evidence of this based on, survey data. But basically, people tend to essentialize and treat as if they're universal, they're social categories. So you think that the category religion is universal, or people tend to think that different people of different religions have different essences, or there's been a lot of great critical work on the category race and how horrible it is and how deeply its essentialization undergirds contemporary American culture and as well as elsewhere and what have you. And so for that reason, there's been a strong turn against essentialism in a whole range of disciplines, including in feminist theory, which is how I begin this chapter. But anti-essentialism on its own, like many other kinds of negations, tends to, is great as a critique, but then doesn't necessarily end up anywhere. It just describes the thing that it's trying to dissolve, while at the same time being heavily invested in the thing it's trying to disintegrate. So what I want to suggest is that, anti-essentialism is important, but it doesn't go far enough. And so by contrast, I gesture toward Whitehead and others more specifically who begin to think about the world in terms of processes. And so Whitehead famously had a process ontology, or process metaphysics. He was most interested in physics. He wasn't interested in the social world. Here, what I'm interested in is what we might call the social world. And I want to note that it should almost be common sense, but many of the categories through which, many of our social categories are basically processes. One of the things that we think of as, central to our social categories are constantly changing and evolving. They tend to evolve in certain kinds of ways, or change in certain kinds of ways. They tend to be heterogeneous in their formation. They tend to recruit other processes. Social kinds tend to cross-cut. All these different things that we might say about our social categories are actually the same kinds of things we want to say about processes. Now, some people who have already looked at processes, I'm thinking about thinkers like Bill Connolly, have tended to get out of looking at Whitehead and others, a notion of flux. Like if things are processes, then they could suddenly change in unpredictable ways. Actually, in the cases of the social, I don't think that's necessarily true. What I think is that what we might call the social world is constantly unfolding, and it has various rates of change. So sometimes surprising ones. And I rehearse a long litany of scholars in different disciplines: anthropologists talking about change in cultural transmission, linguists talking about linguistic shifts, economists talking about changing in economic and social practices, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I want to suggest that as long as things are not changing faster than we're studying them, we can begin to study and talk about them. And there may be cases in which they are, in which case we have to recognize that. But all that is to say, many of the things that we're interested in are changing in ways that we can at least describe retroactively. We can talk about all the changes that went on before they came to the present moment. And even if we can't necessarily predict, we can describe our current moment and how they're unfolding. So what I suggest is that a reorientation toward the social sciences in terms of processes, not as a metaphor, but actually in a very literal sense as actually things, thinking about them in terms of processes, gives us new insights into them. And it addresses many of the critiques that I had, that I articulated in the earlier chapter, that I described in the earlier chapter. Many of the ways that we're deconstructing things make sense if what we're actually talking about is processes that are being mistaken for substances. And so then what I then suggest is that this gives us a broader sense. And I have in chapter 3 a kind of first pass at what this tells us about the kinds of things we're talking about in the social sphere, that they tend to be high entropic, for example. So, that they don't have single easy essences that are definable by necessary and sufficient conditions, that they tend to be interdependent, that they tend to cross-cut. Anyway, I list a lot of things, that they tend to be abstractions or reifications, that tend to be treated with misplaced concreteness, that they tend to be normative, that they tend to lack discrete boundaries, et cetera, and that they tend to be mind dependent and historically and culturally contingent. And I think if you grant all of that, then you've actually discovered quite a bit. Where all this stuff that looked like negative work, that looked like it was merely deconstructive, then we can see what it is telling us about the way that quote unquote the social is put together. And so again, I'm not reconceptualizing the social world primarily as a matter of terminology or metaphor. I'm not trying to get rid of nouns or something like that. But what I want to do is show us that thinking about focusing on processes over substance in the human sciences leads us toward different modes of investigation. And it reinforces, it should get us out of certain cliches and open our minds toward different kinds of endeavors. And so different kinds of research and scholarship. All that is to say, just to recap, I think thinking about the social world in terms of processes should open up new avenues of research and be a way of granting much of the critique that might otherwise be associated with anti-essentialism, deconstruction, and what have you. And so that's like a kind of first move of that section. So how the social kinds exist? How do social things exist? They exist as processes, for example. Yeah.
Let's come to chapter 4, and this kind of unfolds from chapter 3 itself, and where you distinguish between social categories and social kinds. And I think this is something, in this chapter, I think there are many concepts to grapple with in terms of how you introduce anchoring also. So I think, say something about this chapter, yeah.
Yeah, so in this chapter, I begin by asking the question, what is the social world made of? And I note that what seems to be to many people the obvious answer, individual people, turns out to be a problem. So this was anchoring in a huge range of disciplines where rejected older notions of cultural or social holism and became really invested in something called methodological individualism. And methodological individualism, had some benefits to it. It had the distinct advantage of simplicity and clarity, and did a bunch of good work in eliminating certain kinds of bad theorizing. But it has run aground because of its inability to explain things like group norms, institutions, corporations, and collectives, including things like the economy, even as a whole. And so, which is not to say that explanations at the individual level are necessarily false, but that they're often insufficient. And so I wanted to kind of think, and here I'm also engaging with the philosophical literature that calls itself social ontology. So there is some literature here that I'm engaging with. And partially what I wanted to suggest is that if we avoid methodological individualism and various sort of discredited kinds of holism, it gives us a new vantage on the social world. And I want to argue for this proxy term we could call social kinds. And social kinds are not natural kinds. They have their own kinds of properties to them, but they are best understood as temporary zones of stability in unfolding processes that are instantiated in their materialization. I'm reading for myself there, but basically the social world is not built just out of social animals, but also out of their materialized signs. So, you might think of a no smoking sign or an ant's chemical trail as social kinds with certain kinds of social functions. And part of the programmatic maneuver in this chapter too is to by not presuming a nature culture binary or a social social or an anthropocentric account of the social, it lets us see how humans aren't the only social creatures, but actually at the very least, creatures like wolves and ants and dolphins and what have you all can produce certain kinds of social kinds. And what I'm interested in is how humans and other social entities have the capacity to produce second order kinds of entities that have their own kinds of properties that are different than the properties of people. I'm talking about things like hammers, money, traffic jams, but including things like social categories like professors, punk rock, or Buddhist monks, or necessarily disciplinary master categories like religion, art, science, etc. And so I'm using social kinds as a very minimal definition, as a meant to be a very broad category, not meant to be social as opposed to political or social as opposed to cultural, but merely as a proxy for the kinds of clustered properties that are ways that social entities can cluster properties and imbue things with those properties. So. Basically, they're generalizations about people that are not true generalizations about hammers. You can make different kinds of generalizations about hammers and people, but humans are, or another way to think about it is, as in my capacity as chair of the Science and Technological Studies program, I have certain kinds of powers that I don't have in my capacity as when I'm, even though I'm the exact same person, in my capacity as just some guy walking down the street or something like that, even though I'm the same person. Or maybe a better example, the Supreme Court justices have powers that are not just limited to descriptions of what they themselves can do, but require understanding the whole institution of the Supreme Court on a larger scale than just that set of individuals or something like that. All that is to say, I want to make a distinction between the kinds of linguistic categories we use and the kinds of things that we're often trying to refer to with those categories. And not to say that our reference is irrelevant. Actually, our linguistic categories are actually often some of the things that determine properties and social kinds. But to begin to think of the kind of social world as composed not so much of people, but of these kind of social categories or social kinds, which are kind of which I describe as homeostatic property cluster kinds. So and here I'm departing from this homeostatic properties of Cluster-Klein theory in evolutionary or in philosophy of biology, promoted by the late Richard Boyd, who read this read some of my stuff, and I read a bunch of his stuff, and sadly he's passed away. But instead, I depart from his work in some interesting ways because I'm not also trying to capture natural kinds. But what I want to say is that social kinds are socially constructed dynamic clusters of powers, which are demarcated by the causal processes that anchor the relevant clusters. That sounds sort of dense, and we could go into a lot. We could probably talk for a whole hour about that. But here I'm engaging with anchoring literature in the writing of people like Epstein and his book The Ant Trap. But I'm also trying to expand on it and connect it up to notions of property clusters, and thinking about what we mean when we're talking about socially constructed. And the end result is, well, there's a lot there. So it has a lot of implications for how we should do scholarship in the humanities and social sciences. It kind of is an attempt to put turn a Foucauldian genealogical project on its head. Maybe that might be the simplest way to talk about it. When I was trained in many ways primarily as a Foucauldian genealogist, and what you're doing when you're doing a Foucauldian genealogy is primarily showing how something that looks like a unity is actually the process of historical change and discontinuity and diversity. So you show that something is that looks like unity is actually heterogeneous. And a lot of Foucauldian genealogies get their mileage by showing, something is perhaps socially constructed, by which they mean that it's changed over time or it's heterogeneous in certain ways. I want to say we first grant that all the social categories are heterogeneous. In this respect, it's a insofar as it's a hegemonic theory, it's a counter-hegemonic theory in its own way, because it argues that the central feature of things is not similarity, but difference and change and heterogeneity. But then the question becomes, what are the processes by which things similarity might be produced? So in other words, if you assume that the default is change, difference, and instability, the problem to solve is not social change, but social stabilities or social or the different processes that cause different social kinds to have certain clusters of properties and have them somewhat consistently. So in that respect, it's a kind of reversal of what might go on in a Foucauldian project that grants a kind of Foucauldian set of assumptions. And what it lets us do is be much more fine-grained. And when we're talking about the different kinds of ways that certain kinds of social that social kinds can be brought into being. So it's not just linguistic. Like in some disciplines, you think language plus power equals a new category. Often that power is under-theorized, but then language, there are many things that language doesn't do and doesn't produce. So we would have traffic jams even if we didn't have a word for traffic jams. Traffic jams turn out to emerge secondarily once you have cars, for instance, and sufficient congestion or what have you. So anyway, I talk about many different kinds of anchoring processes in this chapter, but I don't think that my list is exhaustive. And I think it has payoffs for how we do all the basic kind of work that we might want to do in the humanities and social sciences. Again, for time reasons, we'll probably want to move forward, but just I encourage you to look at that chapter. It's one of the longer chapters in the book. It's somewhat dense, but I think it provides us with ways to address some fundamental issues in social ontology more broadly, but also think about how the social world is changing. And for those listeners who are activists, I think it provides we have to understand the social world in order to change it. And I think this gives us some clues about how we might engage in that social change. For those of you who are in disciplines that are anti-theoretical, like history departments, I think this shows you why you might have certain kinds of problems and how you might solve them by defaulting to a notion of social kinds. For sociologists and anthropologists, this may anchor or may not anchor exactly, but may help you ground some of the work that you're already doing, but might cause you to change significantly your points of emphasis and may cause you to look in different places for the kinds of things that we're talking about. It helps us realize, I think, much more sophisticatedly than is often the case when we're actually talking past each other. And so one of the parts of this chapter is also an attempt to figure out, when we're talking about religion, are we really talking about the same thing? And in many ways we aren't. And, why are we talking about it the way we are, et cetera? So all of that is there in this sort of dense theoretical chapter. It's probably one of the, I think people find it one of the harder chapters in the book to get through. So, but I hope your listeners will be patient and it has I think a very concrete payoff.
Yeah. That's really true. For me also personally, I think the chapters that I really want to have in-depth discussion and in-depth exploration on is this chapter 3 and 4, which I find is something which is very important actually, because I think these dichotomies and all are something which is not really thought about in philosophy class or in our anthropology department as such. So I think dichotomy of natural kinds and process social kinds and how the anchoring process works and all. I think this is something quite interesting and which I want to have more discussion on. But then we'll move on. Part 3, hylosemiotics. Now I think our discussion naturally leads us into language here. Chapter 4, hylosemiotics, the discourse of things. What really is hylosemiotics?
Yeah. So one of the other things that probably won't escape any of your listeners is that a lot of the fights are actually fights about language. So a lot of fights in academic disciplines, a lot of the characterizations of either postmodernism or in this case, the set of linguistic philosophies often called post-structuralist, or even those of you who read things like new materialism, a lot of these are fights about language and meaning, whether they're, and a lot of things that we're doing in the humanities and social sciences is figuring out, trying to debate around interpretation. So, in the formulations of people like Ricoeur or Charles Taylor, humans are self-interpreting animals. We are meaning, we're hermeneutic beings. And so this chapter starts out from a particular kind of dissatisfaction with the dominant theories of meaning that I was getting both in from folks in first and foremost from folks in post-structuralist determined environments, people like Derrida and company, but also from analytic philosophy. And so, thinkers like Kripke and for those of you, and Putnam, and for those of you listeners who happen to be in analytic philosophy, we have long characterized philosophy and theory in terms of the linguistic turn, as Richard Rorty's famous compilation on that subject. And so, there's been a lot of ink spilled about language and meaning. And the dissatisfaction I had, and it came to me at a particular moment, I was actually doing fieldwork in Japan at the time about this particular Shinto Buddhist shrine that venerates Thomas Edison in a divinized form. And while I was, did my fieldwork at the shrine, and I went for a hike, and I saw a snow monkey that kind of communicated at me, kind of chattered at me, and it's sort of one of those random things that could have just been, I could have ignored, but it made me begin to worry about how we might think of human language making practices on a continuum with the animal world, and to think about these questions about how language might produce the environment, and how the connection between language and perception. So one of the things that a lot of theorists about language, let's say in linguistics departments or in philosophy departments, have tended to do is be super specialized and to separate issues of existence, perception, and language. But I wanted to argue that you can make a lot of progress if you kind of consider those things together. In other words, you kind of move beyond the linguistic turn insofar as it's not paradigmatically a focus on language as just human spoken language, but beginning to think about the meaning-making activities of not just humans, but other animals, right? And so, noting that there are certain unique features of human languages, but noting that even if human languages are unique in some ways, they had to evolve from somewhere, and they may be more contiguous than you might think with other non-human communicative practices. And so to do that, first I kind of rehash Saussure and why many of the so-called post-structuralists were not so much showing problems with language in general as showing why a broadly Saussurean philosophy of language encounters certain paradoxes. And runs aground. Like if you think all meaning is difference, which is not something Saussure actually said, although he said a version of that, but he qualified it elsewhere. But if you think all meaning is difference and there's no such thing as reference, you're going to get into a mess. You're going to come to think that, language is going to be is impossible. Communication is impossible, perhaps. So that doesn't seem like a promising route. And then there's a group of folks called new materialists who already know that they're rejecting that, but I want to argue that they then take many of the features of a broadly Saussurean philosophy of language and just turn them into ontology, unfortunately. I mean, I read that stuff. A lot of it has some use, but, the notion of assemblage is the exact same thing as the word structure. The same word in French is translated sometimes as structure and assemblage, but now assemblages are supposed to be features of the world instead of features of language. Or you might think of actant, which Bruno Latour got from narrative theory and then projects it onto the world. Or there's a whole bunch of stuff that's basically just lit theory projected onto the environment, and I don't think that's the right way to do it. I think the new materialists were right to focus on the materiality of language or materiality of the world, but they were unsophisticated in that they had inherited too much from a set of theories. Let me not say unsophisticated, but let me just say that they had inherited much more from the post-structuralism that they were repudiating than they recognized. And so many of their assumptions about the world were just ontologized versions of post-structuralist theories of language. So what's an alternative? Well, this is something that I began thinking about and talking about with my brother, actually, Seth Josephson, who is a critical animal studies guy. And what we had observed already is that if you tried to base a notion of meaning not on Saussure, but on thinkers like Peirce, Charles Saunders Peirce, and particularly a Baltic German biologist named Jakob von Uexküll, you might have a very different sense of what the world could look like. In other words, if you assume instead of the Saussurean doctrine about the about signs and the arbitrariness of the sign and the notion of difference, etc., you began to think about different ways that meaning might be constructed. And what Uexküll adds is this notion that animals, broadly understood, are hermeneutic beings, that when a tick is in an environment, it's looking and sensing for different kinds of things. It's not just producing communicative signs, but it's looking for aspects of its environment to interpret. And so coming out of that, I start to look at the materialization of signs. I bring together here very more explicitly more certain theorists, Peirce, to some extent Heidegger, to some extent Ruth Millikan, and Jakob von Uexküll. Drawing them together, I think it shows us how sentient beings have the capacity to interpret both voluntary and involuntary signs. The contrast here being scalar rather than binary, but that we interpret things both that are conscious communicative acts, like what I'm trying to say to you right now, but unconscious things, like if you were if we were actually like totally visually, you could see that I'm drinking tea and that I'm running out of my tea or whatever. Like that's something I'm not meaning to communicate, but that you can read. That's a sign that you can read in me or in your environment, and that this gives us a better sense about what's going on when animals are communicating involuntary signs, but also in involuntary signs. In other words, what this is, broadly speaking, is an inferential account of meaning that connects meaning up to processes of sign production and sign consumption, and looks at how signs are both produced and consumed by a full spectrum of creatures, not just people, but also many other, I'm keeping it a little bit open-ended, but sentient beings, at the very least, things like cats and dogs and, ticks, etc. And I think stepping out from that solves us a bunch of problems in philosophy of language. And I say this with some humility. There's some analytic, if there are analytic philosophers listening, I know that I still some distance to go. I cut my some of the sections of the chapter that were longer engagements with Asal Kripke and Putnam, and my Quine section got really trimmed down. But and there's more work to be done there. But I think, at the very least, I think it gives us a fresh approach to semiotics. I'm building off of thinkers also like Grice, but arguing against notions of natural information. For those of you listening for whom that name dropping means anything, but what I want to suggest is that it solves problems. For example, in much of the post-structuralist world, people get this idea that translation is impossible. And the irony, of course, and I'm not the first to observe this, but there's a strong irony in that, because many of the arguments for the impossibility of translation are themselves translations. So when Derrida wants to tell you about how translating James Joyce is impossible, translating James Joyce into French is impossible, he provides a translation of James Joyce. And the better and more elaborate his translation of James Joyce, the more he's able to convince you that something is lost. Or, in Benjamin Whorf, when he's talking about how the ability of indigenous American languages to communicate things that are not communicable in what he calls standard European languages, he communicates them in standard European languages. And even more fundamentally, so this is a fundamental paradox. The more you can tell me that is lost in translation, in other words, the more things that should justify your theory of the impossibility of translation, the more that very theory is undercut. And we might also add that we mostly get these theories themselves in translation. So I note that we get, the impossibility of translation, which was articulated in French and then is translated into English, and then, or what have you. So I want to focus on how this kind of hylosemiotics, or by which I mean a kind of materialized semiotics, helps us work through what the limitations of translation, and show how it's possible, even if it's fraught and difficult in many different ways, and in ways that I think will be a benefit of those listeners who are themselves interested in questions of translation. And then, in addition to that, I also then talk about different ways in which focusing on doing our thinking about perception, the world and language together can address not just issues of reference, but also questions about how mind and the environment relate to each other. So there's been this trend, for example, in certain cognitive science circles to focus on versions of the embodied mind or extended mind. And we can begin to think about how knowledge emerges from the exploratory manipulation of the physical world, or about how every kind of meaning, communicative meaning, requires materialization. You only know I'm talking to you because sound waves have been materialized in the environment, or because things have been written down, etc. Again, another dense chapter, but one that I think has some concrete payoffs in helping us think through interpretation. In other words, in a way, deepening and working through the linguistic turn by looking at its materialization, and how it shows us, how different kinds of interpretations come into being, and how not just humans, but a bunches of other kinds of creatures in our environment are hermeneutic beings. Yeah, interpretive creatures.
Yeah, and prior to reading this book, I was reading Graham Herman, the object-oriented ontology, and I was also reading about the extended mind and all of those aspects. And I think while reading this book, all of it kind of came together in these chapters, and I think that was quite interesting. And I think, these chapters, how it provides a way beyond the linguistic categories of postmodernism is something very interesting for readers to look through and also to debate about. I think that is something which is very helpful in this very chapter. So let's move to the part 4 of the book, knowledge and value. Now, the chapter 6 is zetetic knowledge. Now, this chapter delves into epistemology, and epistemology is something which I have also personally been dabbling with a lot in my own personal thinking, and I think this is something, the word zetetic knowledge is something which really helped me in terms of thinking about this thing. So what this zetetic knowledge is all about, yeah.
Yeah, so this chapter sets out from the observation that postmodernism is regularly described as a kind of radical skepticism, but it isn't actually a completely radical skepticism. In point of fact, often what it is a kind of what we might call a kind of skeptical dogmatism, which is to say many of the things that get counted as postmodern skepticisms are themselves dogmatic pronouncements, like, knowledge is power, or, meaning is impossible, or something, or language determines thought, or philosophy is logocentric, or something like that. Those are all sort of statements. And the classical skeptical philosopher Sextus Empiricus once distinguished between three moments in thought, basically. First, a kind of people who dogmatically insist that something is the case, and then what he called dogmatic skeptics or academic skeptics, which were those people who knew that they didn't know something. And here he's referring to the so-called academy skeptics or academic skeptics that came to dominance in Plato's academy several generations after Plato. But neither of those does he think was any good. In fact, what he thought the true skeptic was someone who does not know whether he or she knows. So the true skeptic, according to Sextus Empiricus, is one who can doubt even their own unknowing. So that they're not a dogmatic skeptic, but a skeptical skeptic. And so from that discourse, I lift up this term zeticism, which was an old, skeptic term that referred to, it means literally like seeker, but using it to refer to what we could think of as someone who is not dogmatically insisting that they don't know, but may want to have a much more fine-tuned notion of knowledge and know that, yeah, I could be wrong or I could be right, to quote John Linden in Public Image Limited, or however that song goes. But to recognize the limitations of knowledge and the limitations also of doubt. So, you could be a brain in a vat, but you could also, be but a demon could have made you think that you might be a brain in a vat, or what have you. And so what I wanted to suggest too is that sort of to historicize it even more, that the problem with many knowledge traditions is not claims to skepticism or emphasis on doubt, but rather claims to certainty. So people like to beat up René Descartes, But the problem with Descartes is not that he said you should doubt everything, but rather that he identified knowledge with certainty, I want to argue. And if you assume that knowledge is certain, and that the primary function of knowledge is to achieve certainty, you're going to run into problems because you're always going to be able to doubt things, even the things that Descartes wasn't himself a skeptic. He actually does his meditations as a sort of declarative exercise before he formulates his theory about the world and how it works, and a kind of weird physics that was influential in its own day, but we don't find engaging at the moment. So what I wanted to suggest is that that we need to de-emphasize certainty. And so Zoteticism could also be thought of as a kind of radical fallibilism, which leans into the doubt rather than into the kind of certainty end of fallibilism. So the chapter first lays out that as a kind of broad epistemological stance. It shows why, for political reasons too, emancipatory knowledge is better than wide-ranging skepticisms, and that actually what we want is humble knowledge, not amplified and infinite doubt. But also for good epistemological reasons, as scholars, we're constantly adjudicating knowledge claims. And then in the latter part of that chapter, it's probably the least radical part of the chapter maybe, but I turn toward a system of inference known as abductive inference, articulated by Charles Sanders Peirce and a bunch of other folks, which thinks about particular strategies for thought for achieving a kind of zetetic knowledge, a kind of humble knowledge. And so I want to talk in that chapter, problems of induction, problems of deduction, and then talk about how abduction is a better way for us to proceed in the humanities and social sciences to adjudicate knowledge claims. And I try and lay out the steps really concretely. Again, this is one of those things that I really don't want to be doing any kind of I want to be applicable for scholars in a range of disciplines. So I think its conclusions are perhaps the turn to abduction is probably the least radical part of that chapter. But I think that chapter hopefully can help clarify some issues in terms of skepticism and in terms of what we should be doing as scholars and what our stance toward knowledge should be. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that is something which is very important in a scholarly circle, trying to have a more better understanding of epistemology in that sense. So let's come to chapter 4, the reevaluations of values. Now, I think even though this book is a very densely theoretical work, I think this chapter on values also touches the personal aspect of human endeavor, right? And I think the talk on values. So how does a metamodern understand values?
One of the things that I'm trying to do in this section as a whole is I note that a lot of times when we're talking about knowledge and value, we have our wires crossed. We tend to invalidate epistemological claims on the basis of values, and there's a strong tendency of repudiating value-based claims basically on skeptical grounds. And I want to think about, and there's this broader notion that what we should be committed to in the humanities and social sciences is a kind of value freedom, or we should be value free. And I want to historicize that. And in that chapter, I start by noting when we got this idea that the humanities and social sciences should be value free, and how that actually met with certain kinds of contradictions. What it actually didn't do was flesh values. I want to argue it didn't actually get rid of values. The call toward value neutrality mostly functioned to drive values underground. I think to its credit, the call to value neutrality did make some helpful observations. We shouldn't be distorting our scholarship in the service of predetermined value conclusions. But on the other hand, what tended to happen was we had the proliferation of value-laden terms, but now in a predominantly skeptical or negative key. So, and this occurred both alongside the diffusion of notions of value neutrality and alongside diffusions of notions of cultural relativism, which was originally supposed to be a similar kind of methodological intervention in anthropological circles, sometimes called ethical relativism or cultural relativism. In the very moment when all these things are becoming popular, we were also articulating these kind of negative lodestars. It's the same period in which terms like racism, sexism, homophobia, et cetera, came to dominance. And they were often seen precisely not as values, but we're used to critique. We're using them to critique each other, and I think that's actually good. Those terms are good, and those are important things to critique. But I just want to suggest that we haven't actually been operating under value neutrality. It's just that when people speak up in terms of positive things, they tend to get shot down. And I've read so many academic books where you only get the thing that the scholar really wants in the conclusion. Like it's a long, tedious rehearsal of something, and then only at the very end does someone glimmer for an instant what it is that would actually made the scholarship important to them. And I want to suggest that by owning and being explicit about our values with each other, that actually, in a way, can help us be more objective, that we're working together, and that if you know what my values are, it's going to help you have a sense of what parts of my work to read with more critical scrutiny and what parts not to, or what have you. I mean, it isn't actually to its own benefit to focus on a straw manning or to articulating a kind of value neutrality that we're not actually following. And I also want to argue that we tend to have epistemic values. So when we talk about things as being rigorous or well argued, or when we talk about scholarly, we evaluate our scholarly work in these value-laden terms all the time, even when we're not as explicit about it, even when we don't tend to recognize it. So, to say that something is a well-argued text or whatever is already to say something implicit about it, or to say that something is makes a contribution to the field. I mean, we tend to use value-laden terms all the time, even if we don't recognize them as value-laden. And so, in this chapter, I depart from David Hume's critique, David Hume's treatise on human nature, which is sometimes thought to set up this is-ought distinction. I talk about how Hume didn't think it had the implications that most people think it does. I talk about how that there are, in fact, some legitimate ways to move from an is to an ought. And that's in the first part of the chapter. It doesn't mean anything goes. Again, I don't want to say that this means, you just have values and you throw out all epistemic standards. What I want to show is that I don't like the word fact very much, but let's just use it for a second. I want to show how facts often, the values, adjudicating values often are based on factual claims, and adjudicating what counts as a fact is often based on value-laden claims as well. So it's not that we need to throw out one or the other, but rather that we need to think a lot about our evidence and the standards and values that are built into evidence and into our scholarly arguments. So having done that, in the last part of the chapter, since I've been calling on scholars to put their own values on the table, I want to put my values on the table. And so in a way, as a sort of prolegomena to a future project, I start to talk about what the human sciences could do as a way of life, like what it would mean if we were going to try and think about how we might positively embrace a kind of flourishing. And so here I combine two established discourses, but I think in a novel formulation, namely critical theory and virtue ethics. And I want to talk about the advantages of doing virtue ethics broadly construed. My background is it's particularly in East Asian and South Asian formulations of virtue ethics, but with a little Marxism and Aristotelianism thrown in there as well. But I want to talk about how adding that to critical theory can help address some of the limitations of critical theory, which as wonderful as it is, and how it's a great home to me, and I'm glad to be on a podcast and New Books in Critical Theory. I think we could go further in formulating positive projects. We're really good in critical theory, in particular at addressing and focusing on suffering. And I think that's great. And I don't want us to stop doing that. And we're good at calling out injustice. Also, absolutely fabulous, absolutely important, really valuable. But we're often not very good about talking about the other side. What would more positively formulated society, what would a just world look like? What would it take for humans to be happy? What would, if we call for revolution, but what could be on the other side of that revolution? And so in the very conclusion, I borrow a phrase from Hannah Arendt's on revolution and revolutionary happiness. And I think a little bit about what it would look like to do this kind of fusion between critical theory and virtue ethics, both drawing from some virtue ethics notions of human flourishing, and then and pluralizing them. Sometimes those tend to be a little bit monolithic, but I want to then look at plural forms of human flourishing, not just one, a monolithic version of that. And then also from that, bringing out certain kinds of cautions and critiques built into critical theory so that we can call out some of the limitations of both critical theory and virtue ethics to the benefit of both. And that's the chapter that is most prolegomena-like. It's all of the book each of the main sections of the book could have been its own book. And this one, I'm just sort of at the very end there, just in the last few pages, laying my own values on the table. But I think then, and at one point, the whole structure of the book was in the opposite order. So there was one time when this chapter was the first chapter, and then you could see the way that the epistemology, everything follows through. I wasn't in backward order in terms of all the chapters, but it was in backward order in terms of all the parts. So this was originally going to be the first chapter, but you can read at the beginning or at the end, but in either case, I want to argue that certain orientations toward knowledge are important for human flourishing. And then I want to argue that multi-species flourishing is important for human flourishing. And then once you grant that, you then might want to be able to attend to our multi-species semiotic environment. And that's where our hylosemiotics comes in. And then you might think about how reaching across to people in different cultures and different languages. And that's where philosophies of translation become important. And once having done that, you might notice that social formations are different in diverse parts of the world. And that might lead you to a theory of social kinds. And then once you've done that, you might want to know, what are the limitations of social kind theory and what do we need to deconstruct and what don't we? And then finally, it might lead us toward question simplistic notions of the real and lead us toward a kind of meta-realism. So the whole book could be flipped over. And I have encouraged rereading. Like I think people, and a couple of people have said that they got a lot out of rereading the book because you can kind of, having gone to see where I end up, reread the whole thing in a different way. And I hope to be a benefit. I try and write in a way, again, non-jargony. And I actually taught it in an undergraduate class with some smart undergraduates and had them, ask me things. What do I mean by this, that, and the other thing? And in the editing process, that let me be more specific. And so, but even then, we had to go really slowly. And so the chapters are short, in part because of publishing limitations. Although I'm, very grateful to the press for having published the book. They made me cut, almost half of it. So, it's a dense book, and forgive me for that, but I hope you could get something out of reading it and then perhaps rereading it as well. Yeah. So that's where it ends up. Yeah. And there's a lot there that we didn't get to talk about today. But I think, thankfully, thank you for encouraging me to go through chapter by chapter, because that should give readers a broad sense of the work. And then the end goal is to produce something, a kind of paradigm change in the disciplines. So the title Metamodernism has also caused some confusions because people think I'm describing a pre-existing metamodernism before they pick up the book. And that's not what I'm trying to do. I mean, there are other people have used that term and I engage with them in some detail, but what I'm actually trying to do is provide a new scholarly model that's appropriate to our current epoch. And if that's going to work, it's going to take other people. It's going to have to be a collective endeavor because for reasons I argue in that chapter, knowledge making is not an isolated individual, thinker locked in a room, just, cogitating like Descartes or something, but a communal enterprise that we all have to work at together. And so, but that's what it's trying to call for as a kind of paradigm change across the humanities and social sciences. Yeah. And a specific benefit to many critical subfields. So, I read, I haven't maybe mentioned this yet in this podcast, but the scholarship I'm engaged with is very much in the wheelhouse of not just philosophy, but also world philosophy, and then a lot of humanities and social scientific disciplines, and then counter-hegemonic subfields like critical theory, critical race theory, feminist theory, and queer theory, all play a big role in this book, and you can read it once you read it. But I think that this is, in that respect, allied to, and I've long worked in post-colonial theory, and so this is, all directed toward those kind of endeavors. And I want to suggest that those, let's say, a broad political, epistemological, or scholarly projects would be better served by this kind of work than some of the postmodernist theory, which fits uncomfortably with many of these groups and movements. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think, as I've said in the beginning, this book itself is, as the title suggests, the future of theory, in a sense that I think the contents of the book will be discussed and debated in the years to come. And I think, for me also personally, I think I will have to go back and read the book again. And as I've also said, there are so many things in each chapter that I want to go deep and really discuss about. But I think this is a short podcast, which we don't have time to do that one. So I think this book, in that sense, is something which really speaks about the title itself, right? Metamodernism, the future of theory. Thank you, Josephson Storm, for being here. And I think it's really a pleasure to listen to you speak about what you have written and, such dense ideas and such dense theories that have been provided in the book. And I think it's a really big pleasure for NBN to also have you and to talk about your book. So tell me something about your future project works and also about how someone can reach you. Yeah.
Great. So I'll do this. So first up, you can find me on my professional website, which you can Google Jason Josephson Storm, or my full name, Jason Ānanda Josephson Storm, and find me at Williams College or my blog, Absolute Disruption, which I don't update very often, but once did. I'm also on Twitter, although I don't really like Twitter. In terms of what I'm doing next, so what I'm working on now is one of the things that I was started working on this book, but I just couldn't fit it in. But it's a new theory of power. So one of the other things that I've observed is that in the humanities and social sciences, we often terminate our theories or buttress our theories with reference to power. We say that language is all about power, race is really a question of power, gender is all about power, class is primarily determined by power. I mean, but a whole range of things that we want to say terminate in power. And the thing is that our dominant theories of power basically are broadly Foucauldian, not actually Foucault, but a kind of synthesis of Foucault and a couple other thinkers, perhaps Foucault, a little bit of Gramsci, maybe a little bit of Butler, that kind of gelled in their current form, maybe in the late 80s. I mean, there hasn't been a grand reappraisal of power in significant terms in recent decades. I mean, there are little things here or there. There was a moment, but there hasn't been much beyond Foucault in a fundamental way. And it turns out that the Foucauldian theories of power have some kinds of problems. They were valuable for their own day, but they have certain kinds of explanatory impasses. And also, we aren't really following Foucault. And so the hybrid form is particularly uncomfortable, and it leads toward contradiction. So the new book is an attempt to kind of re-theorize power in a fresh way for the humanities and social sciences. And that's what I'm writing on now. I have about, anyway, I've maybe a third of it written, but I still have a lot to go. So it'll be a little while.
Yeah, really interesting project ahead. And I think we would also love to have you once that work is done, right? And to talk about your work. That's really interesting. And thank you so much, Jason Storm, for being here. And take care.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me here. And thank you, listeners, for listening.